The morning I came home from my fishing trip up near Kenora, I knew something was wrong before I even got out of the truck. It was the third week of September, one of those crisp Ontario mornings where the maples along the street have just started turning and the air smells clean in a way that reminds you why you live here. I'd been gone 11 days. 11 days at a cabin on the lake with my old friend Barry from the mill, catching walleye and not thinking about anything more complicated than whether to use a jig or a spinner. I pulled into the driveway of the house I had lived in for 31 years, and the front door was a different color. Not dramatically different, not painted red or anything obvious like that. But I knew that door. I had painted it myself, twice, and I knew the exact shade of dark green it was supposed to be. What was in front of me was slate gray. Fresh. You could still smell it faintly from the driveway. I sat in the truck for a moment. I told myself I was being foolish. Maybe my daughter-in-law had surprised me, done a little improvement while I was away. She'd mentioned once that she thought the front needed freshening up. I told myself that was all this was. Then I tried my key. It went into the lock smoothly enough, but it didn't turn. I stood on the front step of my own house for what felt like a long time, holding a key that no longer worked, looking at a door that was the wrong color, and I thought about a phone call I had received 4 months earlier that I hadn't told anyone about. A call from a man named Gerald Ashworth, a real estate agent in Mississauga, who had asked me to confirm some details about a property listing he was preparing. A listing for my address. I hadn't confirmed anything. I'd told him there must be a mistake and hung up. Then I'd sat very quietly at my kitchen table and started thinking carefully about my son. My name is Douglas Mackay. I'm 68 years old. I spent 34 years working as a civil engineer for the city of Thunder Bay, and I retired 4 years ago with a pension, a woodworking shop in the garage, and a house that I own outright, no mortgage, assessed at just over $900,000, because the neighborhood had changed considerably since Margaret and I bought it in 1993 for $140,000. Margaret passed away 6 years ago. Breast cancer, caught too late. After she died, I rattled around in that house for about a year, feeling sorry for myself before I decided she would have found that embarrassing, and I started getting on with things. My son is named Trevor. He's 41 years old. He works in finance, or he says he does. He lives in Mississauga with his wife Courtney and their 2 kids, who I adore. Trevor and I were never what you'd call close after his mother got sick. He became distant during the treatment, and after she passed, instead of the 2 of us grieving together the way I'd hoped, he seemed to step back even further. I told myself he dealt with things differently. I told myself he needed time. What I didn't tell myself, because I didn't want to see it, was that he had started looking at me the way some people look at a problem they need to manage. It started subtly, a comment here and there about the house being too big for one person, questions about whether I was keeping up with the maintenance, delivered in a tone that suggested he already knew the answer and didn't like it. Phone calls asking if I was taking my blood pressure medication, which yes, I was. I am not senile. I am 68 years old and in perfectly good health. He sent me articles about retirement communities. He drove up to Thunder Bay one weekend and spent most of Saturday walking through the house with Courtney, the 2 of them murmuring to each other in a way that made me feel like a piece of furniture being appraised. "Dad," he said over dinner that night, "Courtney and I have been talking. We're worried about you up here alone. The winters are hard. The house is a lot of work." "I like the winters," I said. "And the house is not a lot of work. I just replaced the furnace myself." "You're almost 70, he said. "I'm 67, I said. "Which is not almost 70. Any more than 40 is almost 50. He gave Courtney a look. She gave him one back. I noticed it, and I didn't say anything. This was 2 years ago. Over the following year and a half, the pressure increased in ways that were so gradual, I almost didn't notice how far things had moved. Trevor started calling more frequently, which should have felt like a good thing, but didn't, because every call circled back to the same subject. The house. My age. What would happen if something happened to me? He brought up a friend of his whose father had had a stroke and been found 3 days later. He mentioned a statistic about falls in older adults, which I found condescending given that I had hiked 14 kilometers last July. Then he started bringing up my finances. Not directly. Trevor never did anything directly. He would ask questions in a way that made them sound like concern. How was my pension holding up with inflation? Had I looked into whether I was maximizing my TFSA? Did I know what the house would be worth if I sold now versus waiting? He suggested I might want to update my power of attorney documents, which was actually reasonable advice. And when I mentioned I'd been meaning to do that, he said he'd looked into it, and there was a lawyer in Mississauga who could handle everything if I wanted to drive down. I did not want to drive down. I had a perfectly good lawyer in Thunder Bay named Patricia Horton, who had handled my estate planning when Margaret was ill and who I trusted completely. I told Trevor this. He said he was just trying to help. The call from Gerald Ashworth came in May. After I hung up with him, I sat at my kitchen table, and I thought about everything that had happened over the previous year and a half with fresh eyes. Not the eyes of a father who wanted to believe his son had good intentions, just clear eyes. The way I'd have looked at an engineering problem. What was the evidence? What did it suggest? What it suggested was that my son had been in contact with a real estate agent about selling my house without my knowledge or consent. I did not call Trevor. I did not confront him. I called Patricia Horton. Patricia is a sharp woman in her early 60s who grew up in a small town north of Sudbury and has absolutely no patience for nonsense. I explained everything to her calmly, and she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Douglas," she said, "I want you to come in tomorrow. There are some things we need to put in place, and we need to do them quickly." What followed over the next 3 months was the most careful and methodical thing I have ever done in my life, and I say that as a man who once oversaw the structural assessment of 11 bridges in a single fiscal year. First, Patricia and I established a family trust. The house and the majority of my liquid assets were transferred into the trust, with me as the primary trustee and Patricia as the secondary trustee. This meant that I could still live in the house, make decisions about it, do whatever I wanted with it, but any sale would require both trustees to sign. Trevor was not a trustee. Trevor did not know about the trust. Second, I reviewed and updated my power of attorney documents. My previous POA had listed Trevor as my attorney for property. I revoked that and appointed my friend and former colleague Gordge Jesniak instead, a man I have known for 20 years and who I trust without reservation. Third, I had a security system installed in the house. Cameras at the front door, the back door, the garage, and covering the driveway. I had the recordings set to upload automatically to a cloud account that only I could access. Patricia had suggested this. She said that if something was going to happen, I should be able to document it. Fourth, and this was the hardest part, I said nothing to Trevor. I continued our regular phone calls. I answered his questions about my health and the house in the same mild, slightly vague way I always had. When he asked in July if I'd updated my POA documents, I said I was still looking into it. When he asked about the house again in August, I said I'd been thinking about it. I gave him just enough to keep him moving in the direction he was already moving. Patricia called it setting a trap. I didn't like that phrase, because this was my son we were talking about, but I understood what she meant. In late August, Trevor called to say he and Courtney wanted to come up for a long weekend in September. I said I'd love to see them. I also said I'd been thinking about taking a fishing trip with Barry, and would they mind coming the week after Labor Day so I'd be back in time. Trevor said that actually it would work better for them if they came the second week of September. I said fine. We agreed on the dates. What I didn't tell him was that Barry and I had already planned our Kenora trip for the second week of September, and that I'd just moved it up to overlap with his visit. The night before Trevor and Courtney were due to arrive, I packed my truck. I made sure to park it on the street, not in the driveway. I called Barry and told him I'd meet him at the cabin. I called Patricia and told her the timeline. She said she was ready. I left before dawn on a Saturday. I drove north with the windows down and the radio on, and I didn't let myself think about what might or might not happen while I was gone. I fished for 11 days. I caught a lot of walleye. I slept well. What I learned later, from the security camera footage and from documents obtained through Patricia's legal proceedings, is that Trevor and Courtney arrived at the house on that Saturday afternoon with a locksmith. They changed the locks. Over the following week, they conducted 2 separate meetings with Gerald Ashworth at the property. On the 8th day of my trip, they signed a purchase agreement with a buyer. On the 10th day, while I was still at the lake, the deal was presented to a notary. The notary flagged a problem. The problem was that when Gerald Ashworth ran the standard title search, he discovered that the property was held in trust, not in Douglas McKay's name outright. in the McKay Family Trust, and the secondary trustee, one Patricia Horton, had not signed anything. I was told later that Trevor had called Ashworth, in quite a state. He asked how this was possible. He asked how long it had been like this. Ashworth told him he didn't know and suggested he contact a lawyer. Trevor apparently spent the next 24 hours trying to reach Patricia, who was not available to him because he had no standing to demand her availability. On the 11th day, I drove home. I pulled into the street, and I saw the gray door, and I tried my key, and it didn't work, and I smiled. Because the key not working told me everything I needed to know about what had happened while I was gone, and it also told me that the trust had worked exactly the way Patricia said it would. They had changed the locks on a house they did not own and could not sell. I stood on the front step and I called Trevor. He answered on the second ring. There was a pause before he spoke, the kind of pause that meant he was deciding which version of this conversation to have. "Dad," he said, "you're back." "I am," I said. "I'm standing at my front door. My key doesn't work." Another pause. "Dad, I can explain." "I'd love to hear it," I said. "But actually, I have a call with my lawyer in about 10 minutes, so I'll have to hear it another time. You should probably call a lawyer too. A good one." I hung up. I sent a text to Patricia. "Home. Key doesn't work. Proceed." Gord, who lives 2 streets over, came by 20 minutes later with a spare key I'd left with him before my trip. I made a pot of coffee. I sat at the kitchen table, in my kitchen, in my house, and I drank it. The legal proceedings that followed took several months. Patricia filed a civil claim against Trevor and Courtney for attempted fraudulent transfer of trust assets, trespassing, and unauthorized modification of property. She also filed a report with the Ontario Provincial Police, which resulted in a separate criminal investigation into the matter. The civil case was settled out of court. Trevor and Courtney were required to pay all legal costs, including mine, and to pay damages into the McKay Family Trust in the amount of $42,000, which represented the costs I'd incurred in setting up the trust and the security system, as well as Patricia's fees, and a portion of the lost rental income from the period during which the property's sale had been falsely initiated. They were also required to sign a formal acknowledgement that they had no claim whatsoever on the McKay Family Trust or its assets. The criminal matter was more complicated. In the end, Trevor was charged with 1 count of fraud over $5,000 and 1 count of mischief. He pleaded guilty to the mischief charge in exchange for the fraud charge being withdrawn. He received a conditional discharge with 18 months of probation and community service. He did not go to jail, which I have complicated feelings about, but he has a criminal record, and the conditions of his discharge include that he have no contact with me or my property without my written consent. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. What Trevor did wasn't just about money, though it was very much about money. What he did was decide that I was no longer a person capable of making decisions about my own life. He decided, somewhere along the way, that my age gave him the authority to override me. He used the language of concern, the medication questions, the safety worries, the talk about what would happen if something happened as a vehicle for something that had nothing to do with my well-being and everything to do with a financial situation of his own that I only fully understood later. It turned out Trevor's company had been struggling seriously for 2 years, not in a way he'd ever mentioned to me. He owed money to people who were not patient about being owed money. The $900,000 my house would have fetched on the current market would have solved that problem very neatly, especially since he had apparently convinced himself that it was, in some sense, his money anyway, an inheritance he was simply collecting early. I think about that sometimes. The idea that someone can look at a person they love, a person who is healthy and capable and living a full life, and decide that person's time is essentially already up, that the life that person is living is just a delay to be managed. I don't see Trevor now. I don't know if I ever will again. I miss my grandchildren, who were not part of any of this, and who I think about often. I've been told by Gord, who has a mutual acquaintance with Courtney's sister, that Trevor is doing some kind of work in financial consulting now, that they sold their house in Mississauga and downsized. I don't wish him ill. I don't wish him anything, really. I just wish he had been different. What I do now, I fish. I work in my woodworking shop. I finished a rocking chair last spring that I'm particularly proud of. I have dinner with Gord and his wife Rose every other week. I walk along the lakeshore most mornings when the weather allows. and sometimes when it doesn't. My house still has the dark green door. I repainted it myself the week after everything was resolved. Same shade Margaret chose in 2004. It took me a Saturday afternoon, and I enjoyed every minute of it. If you're watching this, and you have aging parents, or if you are an aging parent yourself, I want to say something directly. Age is not incompetence. Being older does not mean you have lost the right to make decisions about your own life, your own home, your own money. Anyone who treats your age as a reason to override your judgment, especially when that person stands to benefit financially, deserves the hardest scrutiny you can apply. And if you're in a situation where you feel that pressure, where someone in your family is circling your assets and disguising it as concern, please talk to an independent lawyer. Not a lawyer your family member recommends. Your own lawyer. Update your estate documents. Look at a family trust if your situation warrants it. Document everything. It costs money up front, but it costs considerably less than losing everything you've built. A power of attorney is one of the most powerful legal documents that exists. It gives another person the ability to act on your behalf in financial and legal matters. It can be an enormous gift to give to someone you trust completely. Given to the wrong person, it is the key to your front door, your bank accounts, and your life. Choose that person with the same seriousness you would give any decision that could change everything. I am 68 years old. I live alone in a house I have owned for 31 years. I am not a burden. I am not a problem to be managed. I am a person, and I plan to keep being one for quite some time. The walleye up near Kenora were excellent, by the way. Barry and I are already planning next September.